Kathy Steblen. I'm a licensed mental health counselor with a credential called a KSAC. And so that's credentialed alcoholism substance abuse counselor. I've worked for Delphi Drug Alcohol Council for 17, 18 years, and also worked in the Fairport School District for 2 years. I work with students who are identified as having maybe some mental health concerns, drug and alcohol concerns, and work with them. It's very confidential, the work that we do. It's like coming to see a therapist, but it's within the school district. So when kids can release privacy by signing off, and I try to get parents on board and people that they work with, that they trust, to kind of have a team approach. One of the things we know about the teen brain, the human brain develops from the back to the front. The front is really responsible, it's the seat of reason. Kids in adolescence till about 25 years old are still developing that part of the brain. So that part of the brain is responsible for looking at behavior and being able to identify consequences down the road. Impulse control, and also teens tend to look at the rewards of some of their risky behavior and minimize what could be some of the consequences. So it's not that they don't know that this could be risky, but boy, won't this be fun, or won't people admire me if if I'm hanging out with them? So the reason that alcohol can be such a disaster for teens, and it's linked to the 3 highest causes of death for teens. So the first one is unintentional accidental injury. And that includes if somebody drowns, fires, overdose, and just physical injuries, falling. Car accidents is in that category. And car accidents, really, there's 5 highest causes of death for teens, and I just named the 3 linked to alcohol. Out of the 5, car accidents are responsible for 1/3 of the deaths of teenagers. Homicide used to be second, and that was mainly for non-Hispanic black males. And then there's suicide. It has recently switched, and suicide is now the second leading cause of death for teenagers. And when we think about mental health issues, people are more prone to drug and alcohol use because of mental health issues. That's a risk factor. And so one of the things we know about teens is that because of that prefrontal cortex still developing, they are more impulsive. And if we're thinking about suicide and the risks of suicide, and also the proliferation of firearms, if the means is very lethal, it can be a very serious issue. I agree with it. And part of the reason I agree with it is for so many years working with kids, I do a drug history. And I always ask, what's the first drug that a youth ever uses? Even if it's before they even know what it is. And really, I would say invariably, it's alcohol. And the reason is because alcohol is so available. We use it for celebrations. It's seen as a rite of passage. It's sort of seen as a macho thing, someone being able to hold their alcohol. If we think about the Super Bowl coming up, there's going to be commercials about alcohol. So it's really woven into the fabric of our society. And I think that people minimize the problems associated with it, especially in our youth. And so the acute effects of alcohol, like we said, are linked to the 3 highest causes of death. It's also linked to becoming a victim or a perpetrator of sexual assault. It's also linked to risky behavior around sex, so having multiple partners, not using condoms. And when we think about that down the road, can lead to unwanted pregnancies, unplanned pregnancies, and STDs. Kids will tend to feel, I've talked to students in the past who feel very ashamed of some of their behavior while they've been under the influence, and that can impact them later in life. I always say the relationship we have with ourselves is a very important relationship. And when we look at alcohol, we're looking at some pretty serious things that can happen physically as well. So for learning and memory, alcohol tends to shrink the part of our brain called the hippocampus, which is learning and memory. It also, for binge drinking, and 90% of the alcohol consumed by teenagers is through binge drinking. So binge drinking is considered about 5 drinks in about 2 hours on an occasion. But for younger kids, it's less. It's 3, 4 drinks. That can lead to fatty liver. And that is a precursor to cirrhosis of the liver, which is inflammation and scarring of the liver. Fatty liver is reversible, but once a person gets cirrhosis of the liver, that's no longer reversible. Cirrhosis would be. Fatty liver is not. Teenagers can get fatty liver from binge drinking. But if they stop, then it can go back to normal. Yeah, what I've come across, I get my information usually from the Centers for Disease Control or the National Institute for Drug Abuse. They talk about kids by 8th grade. About 50% of students in the U.S. have had at least 1 drink. The amount that a person uses increases with every year. So by the time, if we look at a room full of seniors in high school, it's most likely that 60% have had a drink of alcohol. We look at use in the past 30 days. That's one of the ways that we measure it. So in high school, 33% in 2015 reported that they had an alcoholic drink in the past 30 days. Right. So 18% out of those high school kids, 9th grade to 12th grade, report binge drinking. Binge drinking in adults is considered when someone drinks enough to bring their blood alcohol concentration to a 0.08, which is now the illegal limit for an adult for driving. In teens, they reach that limit quicker than an adult would reach that limit due to body chemistry and the still developing brain. Males tend to drink more than females, and like we said, a lot of the accidents are car accidents, but when we think about kids getting into fights, problems with sexual risk-taking, it really encompasses all the parts of a student's life. So when we look at problems in someone's life, we're looking at how they perform at school and work, how they are in their daily activities, and how they are in relationships. And so you can imagine a lot of problems arise if, we always look at kids who have been participating in sports and getting decent grades in school. Well, it's hard to go to football practice when you have a hangover, right? So kids we kind of look at kids dropping out of things or limiting things that have healthy benefits to it. Whenever I talk about drugs to kids, I always talk about the side effects. So, we have to look at that with medication And when we look at alcohol, the side effects are really, I mean, if we think about hangovers, if we think about not being able to process, we think about acute intoxication is impairing every single one of our senses. So I'll talk to kids about what does it do to your sense of sight? Well, it's double vision. What does it do to your speech? My speech is slurred. What does it do to your hearing? You can't hear as well. If you're at a bar at last call, people are talking very loud. People cannot hear very well under the influence of alcohol. If we're talking about balance, person can't, you know, our roadside test is to have someone walk in a straight line. It just impairs us, and one of the biggest thing it impairs is our sense of judgment. And that's when a lot of the accidents happen. So at a certain point, you know, like around 0.06 or 0.08, a person has a greater estimate of what they're capable of than what they truly are under the influence. And that's when we'll see a lot of risk-taking. Someone who might be, you know, I live by the canal, right? Someone who might look at that bridge, the railing, and say, oh, I'm going to try to balance on that bridge. Or people that are drag racing, you know, back in the day it was more prevalent. But it is a thing where people do not, they cannot think things through clearly to the end result. Sometimes it does. You know, I always say kids are a little cushioned, different from an adult, because they don't have to pay the mortgage, right? Some have children, but others, you know, don't have that responsibility of children or going to a job. So I think in some ways they're cushioned from some of the same consequences that might befall an adult. But, you know, with kids, what I really talk about is at their age, the goal is to develop into a responsible adult. And what are the things you need to do to become a responsible adult? When we're talking about social interaction, kids at that age are starting to negotiate relationships with friends, romantic relationships. They're having new experiences, maybe the first time having a boyfriend or girlfriend, the first time recognizing maybe a different sexual orientation, the first time that they start a job, a new job. All these things are skill building things. And part of the goal of teenagers is the question that they ask is, who am I, right? It's identity. And I always tell them, nothing will take you farther away from knowing who you are than drugs and alcohol. Because if that's your go-to thing, when you're sad, when you're lonely, when you're angry, when you're bored, you never work to develop and practice skills to get you through hard times. If what you constantly go to is a bottle, you will not be able to tolerate uncomfortable feelings. So one of the things we do is to help kids develop skills in order to manage uncomfortable emotions that they might feel. And we have to sort of normalize it, because kids really, they may be feeling things for the first time, like I said, and to make it sort of a universal, there's a universality to it. So I always take kids very, very seriously. If they've had a first breakup or a very hard breakup, it can be a very devastating thing. So what are some things, I ask them, what are some things that you can do to help yourself, non-drug related? Oftentimes it's listening to certain kinds of music, it's talking to a friend, petting their dog, talking to someone close to them who supports them, and we work on identifying who that person might be. Cultivating relationships. If they're in a peer group that is leading them to do things that maybe doesn't jive with their morality or their values or their parents' supervision, we talk about, well, maybe you could join a club. Maybe you could do a sports activity. Maybe you could get to know that kid that you sit next to in lunch and you get along with very well. Maybe you can invite them on something over the weekend. You know, it's all about kind of reaching out. Some kids will use alcohol to sort of ameliorate feelings of social anxiety. So there'll be kids who feel like, I don't know what to say in a conversation with someone. And so in counseling, I sort of model, you know, sometimes we don't even talk about drugs or alcohol. We model, hey, what did you do this weekend? What movie did you see? Just things that we would talk about normally in a conversation. Depending on the age of the student, a recovery 12-step program is appropriate. However, the younger the student, the less it works. When I've referred kids to 12-step programs, I go with them. I will meet them there. I've had parents drop them off at a Narcotics Anonymous or Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, and I will be there to greet them. The reason being is those groups, we don't know. It could be someone off the street. It could be some people that are predatory. And I'm not saying just that population, but in any population where there's many adults in the group and then a teenager walks in, it puts them at risk. So, you know, I will meet kids out because I think it's good for them to hear it coming from the non-expert, from someone who's been there and done that. But what happens with teenagers, more than with adults, is they will tend to separate themselves. So if the person at the group is talking about using heroin, they'll walk out and they'll just say, well, I never would use heroin. But one thing I want to say about parents, when parents disclose their drug or alcohol use, it is always seen as a green light, even if it's framed as regretful. And I tell people this because I think it's very important. I think parents come at it with a very good intention to talk about their past history. And it never works. Kids will invariably think, well, they turned out okay. Or they'll look at it as hypocrisy. So I'll sometimes have students ask me, have you ever used drugs or alcohol? And I say to them, if I say yes, you'll say, well, you turned out okay, so it's fine for me to use it. If I say no, you'll say, well, how can you understand me? So I say, just look at it like this. There's people out there using drugs and alcohol that don't care about you. And whether or not I've used drugs and alcohol doesn't matter. Judge me on how I respect you, how I care for you, how you feel respected and cared for. We have some experience with kids who have been identified as having some drug and alcohol issues within the school district. So the agency I work for requires that we run groups for kids. One of the groups that I'm running currently is called COSAP, which is Children of Substance or Alcohol Abusers. And so kids, they're not necessarily using, but they're at higher risk because of hereditary things and the environment. So, there talk of a sober school coming, and I know in other places they do that. So it's sort of a school of kids who are in recovery for drugs and alcohol.
Okay. Now you mentioned parents. What then do you tell parents?
So when I work with parents, it's very important at a very young age. I think we start too late educating our kids, and it would be age appropriate, right? So one of the things parents can do as kids get older is to, we can have teachable moments by watching the news. Oh my gosh, look at that person got a DWI, right? Or there's somebody swerving on the road. That's not safe. They probably drank too much. We also don't want to normalize the use of alcohol. And adults, there's many adults that can drink alcohol responsibly. But I look at it as an age thing. So the longer that we can delay in teens the first use of drugs or alcohol, the better off they're going to be, because we know the younger the age at which they start, the more likely it develops into a substance use disorder, alcohol use disorder.
Mm-hmm.
So parents really should never say, hey, go get me a beer. Or, hey, could you open the beer for me, right? We don't want to normalize the use. We also we want to model responsible use. We don't want to be intoxicated in front of our kids. The relationship that parents have with their kids is one of the most important factors. So kids whose parents talk to them about the risks of alcohol use are 50% less likely to either start or to continue to a point where there's problems.
Mm-hmm.
And I think parents often underestimate their power, but it's a good thing to monitor our kids to a point where we know, in general, where they are, who they're with, and what the activity is. We also want to supervise, because 26% of the kids say that the way they acquire alcohol is through a family member, a parent or family member, and then there's a high percentage who get it from someone who's 21 years old or older. That's right. And we often don't think to lock up our alcohol, but we should have, as a parent, an idea of the accessibility of it and how much might be missing. So the warning signs parents should look for, if we're talking about acute problems with alcohol, we look at if someone smells of alcohol. We look in their eyes, if eyes are bloodshot, if the pupils are very small. If kids are driving age, it's a good idea to check out the car, because cars can be traveling stashes, alcohol bottles under the seat and what have you. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the things. We also want to look at the peer group. Is it a peer group where alcohol use is normalized? Get to know our kids' friends. It's great to be in a car where we have our kid and a couple other kids and just talk to them about their hobbies and interests. I have a daughter, and when she goes to someone's house, is the parent going to be home? And I know with texting now, we sort of drop our kid off, and when we come to pick them up, we text, we're out here waiting. I go up to the door. I do old school. I meet the parent, shake their hand, and know that the parent's there. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that, the parent's going to be supervising all the time. But when people pick up their kids or their kids return home, we kind of want to look and see, what did you do and how was it and did you have a good time? But we're also sort of looking at our kid to make sure, they're not disheveled and under the influence. Well, some of it has to do with a change in peer group. Some of it has to do with things that they used to enjoy that they drop out of. Oftentimes teachers will be the first ones to sort of be alerted to a problem because of a drastic drop in grades. They will get a very good baseline of what the student is like throughout the year. And so if we see drastic changes in someone's behavior, mm-hmm. One of the first places that they can go is their pediatrician, because it could be a mental health problem, but it could be drug and alcohol related. Mm-hmm. And a pediatrician usually has a very good baseline. They're usually very trusted. Parents, if they feel concerned, can take kids to get a formal drug and alcohol evaluation. Mm-hmm. And find some things out. So the behaviors are things where if a student starts to withdraw from activities, maybe from family activities, if they're very secretive, kids at that age naturally want more privacy, but if there's a thing where they're locking a door or they're becoming very irritable, or very irritable when a parent asks questions about activities and what did you do. That's something that we should be aware of.
Mm-hmm.
And they're kind of putting up a wall.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, role of advertisers. One of the things that I've always noticed, you know, on a pack of cigarettes, they have the Surgeon General's warning. And it often is specific. You know, it causes lung cancer, respiratory disease, right? When we look at alcohol, there's no warning on it. There is no dose, right? So if someone looks at a fifth of whiskey, it doesn't look like very much. To consume that entire bottle could be deadly. There's no warning for kids. There's no way for them to really know. This poster has to do with standard drink size. It is not recommended for students to drink alcohol or to even have a first use until they're 21 years old. So in every one of these standard drinks, there's 6 ounces of pure alcohol or ethanol. So that comes out to 14 grams. When we're looking at 12 ounces of beer, if we go to a frat party or what have you, the red party cups hold 16 to 18 ounces. So when someone thinks they've had 3 beers, they've had 4, if it's in those cups. All of these have the same amount of pure alcohol. We think of hard liquor as being, you know, more dangerous than beer. People can get as intoxicated on beer, it's just more concentrated, less in a shot of liquor. There is. I mean, they spend $2 to $4 billion a year advertising alcohol. It's with very attractive men and women out there promoting it. Even last year, I think it was, Helen Mirren did a commercial. I think it was Budweiser. And she talked about the risks of driving while under the influence, drunk driving. But at the end, she said, "Come on, people, it should be fun." And then she takes a sip and she says, "Ice cold," right? So it's promoted by movie stars, it's promoted by rap stars, you know, and kids see this. I mean, it has to be doing something for them to spend $2 to $4 billion. Now, there's not a lot of direct correlation, there's not a lot of study around this, but it is so built into our fabric that kids see it all the time. Well, one of the new things is pill use, and it's usually opiates, painkillers, oxycodone, Vicodin, tramadol, things of that nature. So that's a bit new, starting in the later 90s, because pain became a vital sign. Before that, it was not. And so doctors were obligated to treat pain with painkillers. But the part that is missing is taking a drug history and looking at some of the vulnerabilities of some of the patients. Now there's some things put in place by Cuomo where someone cannot, to say they get a script, they have to go back after 7 days to renew that script instead of just automatically having it be renewed. But when kids get wisdom teeth out and things like that, they'll come home with quite a bit. And so some of the problems we see is most people will get physically addicted, which they'll go through with some withdrawal. But the psychological addiction is the part that keeps that going. And what we found is people that go on to use heroin, it becomes more expensive to use the pills, and it's harder to get, so they sometimes will go to the street and use heroin. And we know that can have fentanyl in it, and heroin itself, right, can be deadly, but when it's laced with some of those really highly concentrated painkillers,
people die.
It's a respiratory death.
Yep.
Yeah. So we have Narcan training at my agency, which automatically reverses an opiate overdose, and I would recommend that to anyone who can get that training, because we're hearing about more and more deaths of that nature. Well, We know that 90% of addiction begins in the teenage years. I'd like teenagers to know that they're very vulnerable to becoming addicted, and that can become a lifelong disease. And this is a time in their life where they are really charged with developing ways to cope and to negotiate relationships and to succeed in school and in their jobs and to perform well. And drugs and alcohol work completely counter to that goal. So this should be a time of having fun and experimentation, but not to experiment with drugs and alcohol.
But I hear what you're saying, and your rap is very, very strong. Yeah, I can dig it. And I'm not lying to you. That's right.
Feelings are harder than people think they are.